The day my husband's will was read was the day I learned exactly how little the rest of his family thought of me. It was a gray Monday morning in Boise, Idaho, 3 weeks after Daniel Carter's funeral. The law office of Leonard Briggs sat on the third floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind of place where everything smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. I remember gripping the strap of my purse while the lawyer adjusted his glasses and began reading. My name is Emily Carter. I was 32 years old, newly widowed, and sitting at a long conference table across from Daniel's daughter. Olivia Carter leaned back in her chair like she already owned the room. At 31, she had the same dark hair as her father, but none of his quiet kindness. Beside her sat her husband, Marcus Hale, a real estate developer who carried himself with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. They didn't even try to hide their anticipation. Leonard Briggs cleared his throat. Per the final will and testament of Daniel Thomas Carter, the formal language blurred together until one sentence made Olivia sit up straighter. The residential property located on West River Street in Boise, including all associated financial accounts connected to that property, is to be transferred to Olivia Carter and her husband, Marcus Hale. Olivia's lips curved into a satisfied smile. Marcus squeezed her hand. "That's the one we expected," he murmured quietly, though not quietly enough. I kept my expression neutral even as my stomach tightened. Daniel and I had lived in that house together for nearly 8 years. The lawyer continued, "And to his wife, Emily Carter, Daniel Carter leaves his secondary property located in Lincoln County, Montana." There was a pause. Olivia frowned slightly. Montana Leonard flipped a page. The property consists of a small cabin and surrounding land purchased approximately 2 years ago. Marcus let out a short laugh. "You mean that place in the woods," he said. "I thought that was some hunting shack he bought on a whim." Olivia looked at me, then back at the lawyer. "That's it?" she asked. "The Montana property is listed as the sole asset designated for Mrs. Carter," Leonard replied calmly. For a moment the room was silent. Then Marcus leaned back in his chair and chuckled again. "Well," he said, "I guess Daniel knew what he was doing." Olivia shook her head with a faint smile. "Emily, that place is basically abandoned. It's ours from anything," Marcus added. "Honestly, it's probably not even worth fixing up. You'd be better off selling it for the land." Their tone wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse, dismissive, like the entire matter was too insignificant to care about. Leonard slid a small envelope across the table toward me. "Your husband specifically asked that this be given to you with the property documents." Inside the envelope was a single key attached to a metal tag. Lincoln County, Montana. I stared at it, turning the key slowly between my fingers. Olivia was already talking about contractors and renovations for the Boise house. Marcus was discussing property values. Neither of them looked at me again, as if my inheritance, Daniel's final gift to me, was nothing more than a joke. But as I sat there holding that key, one thought kept pressing into the back of my mind. Daniel Carter had never done anything without a reason. And if he had left me a forgotten cabin in the mountains of Montana, then something about that place mattered, a lot more than anyone in that room seemed to realize. And for the first time since the reading of the will began, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sell the cabin. I was going to see it. 3 days after the will was read, I packed a small suitcase into the trunk of my car and left Boise before sunrise. It was Thursday morning, early enough that the streets were still quiet. The sky over Idaho was pale and cold, the kind of gray-blue light that made the city feel half asleep. I kept Daniel's key on the passenger seat beside me, the small metal tag catching the faint light from the windshield every time the car turned. Lincoln County, Montana. The name still felt distant and unreal. The drive was longer than I expected. Once I crossed the state line into Montana, the towns grew smaller and farther apart. Gas stations appeared every 40 or 50 miles, each one surrounded by wide, open land and mountains that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Daniel had bought a property out here 2 years ago, and somehow I had never known. That thought stayed with me for miles. Daniel had always been a careful man. He worked as an accountant for a construction firm in Boise, the kind of job that made him methodical about everything money schedules paperwork. Our life together had been quiet and predictable. We paid our bills, hosted occasional dinners, and talked about maybe traveling someday. He had never once mentioned a cabin in Montana. Around midday, I stopped for gas near a small town called Libby. The station looked like it had been there for decades, 2 pumps, a convenience store, and a faded sign that had probably seen better days in the early 90s. Inside, a man in his 60s stood behind the counter reading a newspaper. He glanced up when I walked in. Passing through, he asked, "Sort of," I said. "I'm looking for a property outside town, Lincoln County, a small cabin." He studied me for a moment before nodding slowly. "Lots of cabins around here," he said. "You got a name, Daniel Carter." The man folded his newspaper. "Yeah," he said after a second. "I remember that name." Something in his tone made me pause. "You knew him?" I asked. Wouldn't say that he replied, but he stopped in a few times over the last couple years, bought supplies, asked directions out toward the forest roads. He rang up the gas I had paid for and slid the receipt toward me. "Quiet guy," he added. "Didn't talk much." That sounded exactly like Daniel. I thanked him and stepped back outside. The wind had picked up while I was inside, carrying the sharp scent of pine from the mountains beyond the town. I leaned against the car for a moment, looking at the key in my hand again. Daniel had been here, more than once, and he had never told me. The road leaving Libby turned from asphalt to packed gravel after about 15 miles. Tall pine trees lined both sides, their branches casting long shadows across the narrow path. My phone signal disappeared somewhere along the way. By the time I reached the coordinates listed in the property documents, the sun was already beginning to sink behind the mountains. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing surrounded by thick forest. For a moment, I just sat in the car staring at it. Olivia hadn't been wrong. From the outside, the place looked old. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, and windows that reflected the dark trees around it like black mirrors. It looked exactly like the kind of abandoned cabin Marcus had laughed about in the lawyer's office, a forgotten house in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly across the clearing. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. The key felt heavier in my hand than it should have. Daniel Carter had chosen this place for a reason, but standing there in the quiet Montana forest looking at the worn boards and crooked railing of the porch, it was hard to imagine what that reason could possibly be. Still, I climbed the wooden steps. The cabin door stood in front of me, silent and closed, and after a moment I lifted the key toward the lock. The key turned in the lock more easily than I expected. For a moment, I just stood there on the porch, my hand still on the doorknob, listening to the quiet of the Montana forest behind me. The air had grown colder as the sun dropped lower behind the mountains. Pine trees surrounded the clearing in every direction, their dark silhouettes moving slightly in the evening wind. If the cabin really had been abandoned for years, like Olivia and Marcus believed, the door probably would have stuck. But it didn't. The latch clicked smoothly. That was the first thing that felt wrong. I pushed the door open slowly. The smell inside wasn't the damp, moldy odor I expected from an unused building. Instead, the air carried the faint scent of cedar and something cleaner, like the inside of a place that had been aired out not too long ago. I stepped inside and reached along the wall until my fingers found a light switch. When the overhead light flicked on, I stopped moving. The cabin's interior looked nothing like the weathered exterior. The room was simple but orderly. A wooden table stood near the center of the living space, its surface clear except for a small lantern and a neatly stacked set of coasters. The couch against the far wall had a folded wool blanket draped carefully across the back. No dust, no signs of neglect. Someone had taken care of this place. The floorboards creaked softly under my steps as I moved farther inside. I set my bag down by the door and walked slowly through the main room, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Daniel hadn't been the kind of man who bought property and ignored it. Still, this didn't look like a vacation cabin. It looked used. A narrow hallway led to 2 smaller rooms. One was clearly a bedroom plain, but clean, with a neatly made bed and a dresser that held nothing except a small reading lamp. The second room stopped me in the doorway. It was an office. A sturdy desk stood beneath a window that faced the forest. Shelves lined the walls filled with binders and file boxes that had been carefully labeled in Daniel's precise handwriting. A laptop rested on the corner of the desk beside a closed leather notebook. The sight of his handwriting made something tighten in my chest. Daniel had been here. Not years ago, recently. I stepped closer to the desk. The laptop was shut but plugged into a power strip beneath the table. Beside it sat a small metal lockbox and a stack of folders bound together with a thick rubber band. But what caught my attention first was the envelope. It rested at the center of the desk, placed there deliberately as if it had been waiting. My name was written across the front in familiar block letters. Emily. For a long moment I didn't touch it. Part of me suddenly felt like I had stepped into a place that wasn't meant to be disturbed yet. The cabin was quiet enough that I could hear the faint ticking of a wall clock somewhere behind me. Daniel had prepared this room, that much was obvious, but the question that began forming in my mind wasn't about the cabin anymore. It was about why. Why would Daniel buy a remote property in Montana, set up an office, maman, and leave everything here so carefully organized? And why leave it to me? I picked up the envelope slowly. The paper was thick, the seal unbroken. Whatever Daniel had written inside, he had expected me to read it. But before opening it, I glanced once more around the room, at the labeled files, the closed laptop, the locked metal box. None of it looked random, none of it looked forgotten, which meant one thing was suddenly clear. The cabin in Montana hadn't been the worthless property Olivia and Marcus thought it was. It had been something else entirely, and whatever Daniel had been doing here, he had meant for me to find it. The door opened quietly, almost too easily, as if someone had used it not long ago. For a few seconds, I stayed standing on the porch, the cold Montana air brushing against my face while the forest behind me swayed in the evening wind. The clearing around the cabin was silent, except for the distant sound of branches moving somewhere deep in the trees. Marcus had laughed when he called this place worthless. Standing there now, I wasn't so sure. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the stale, dusty odor you'd expect from a building left empty for years. Instead, the air carried a faint scent of pine cleaner and dry wood. Someone had opened windows here recently. My hand slid along the wall until I found a switch. The overhead light flickered once before turning fully on. I stopped. The inside of the cabin looked nothing like the outside. From the clearing, the place had looked like an old hunting shack ready to fall apart. But inside, everything was neat, almost deliberate. The wooden floors were swept clean. A small couch sat against the wall with a folded wool blanket laid carefully across the back. A narrow kitchen area stood to the left, stocked with simple dishes, and a kettle sitting on the stove. This wasn't an abandoned property. It looked lived in, or at least maintained. I walked farther inside, my footsteps slow against the floorboards. The quiet inside the cabin felt different from the quiet outside, thicker somehow, like the room itself was holding its breath. Daniel had bought this place 2 years ago, and never mentioned it once. A short hallway led toward the back of the cabin. I followed it, passing a small bedroom where the bed had been made with tight hospital corners. No dust gathered on the nightstand, no cobwebs in the corners. The second door along the hallway stood slightly open. When I pushed it wider, I realized immediately that this room was different. It was an office. A solid wooden desk faced a window overlooking the forest. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with neatly arranged binders and file boxes. Each one had a label written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. The sight of it made my chest tighten. Daniel had been organized about everything: finances, receipts, paperwork. Seeing those familiar block letters again felt strangely personal, like he had only stepped away for a moment. I moved closer to the desk. A closed laptop sat near the corner beside a small metal lockbox. A stack of folders rested beside it, held together with a thick rubber band. But the thing that drew my attention first was the envelope. It lay at the center of the desk. My name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. Emily. For a moment, I just stared at it. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of a wall clock somewhere behind me. I picked up the envelope, slowly turning it over in my hands. The paper was thick sealed carefully. Daniel had left this for me. Not for Olivia, not for anyone else. For me. I glanced again at the shelves around the room, rows of labeled binders, several file boxes stacked neatly along the wall. Whatever Daniel had been doing out here in Montana, it hadn't been a weekend getaway. This had been work. Serious work. I sat down in the chair behind the desk, still holding the envelope. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. Another part hesitated, because the moment I broke that seal, I had the uneasy feeling that things about Daniel, about our life, might start making less sense instead of more. Still, I slipped my finger carefully beneath the edge of the envelope. Whatever answers Daniel had left behind, they were waiting inside. For several seconds, I just sat there, the envelope resting in my hands. The office was so quiet that I could hear the wind brushing through the trees outside the cabin. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a branch cracked softly, the sound echoing faintly through the clearing. I ran my thumb slowly along the sealed edge of the envelope. Daniel had written my name with the same careful handwriting he used for grocery lists and tax records. It was oddly comforting to see it again, but it also made something else settle heavily in my chest. If he had prepared this room, these files, and this letter, then he had expected me to find them, eventually. I slid my finger beneath the seal and opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. The letter wasn't long, but the first sentence made me stop breathing for a moment. Emily, if you're reading this, it means something has already gone wrong. I leaned back in the chair slowly. Daniel had always been careful with his words. He wasn't the kind of person who exaggerated or dramatized things. If he wrote a sentence like that, he meant it. I continued reading. Daniel explained that the Montana cabin wasn't a retreat or a vacation property. He had purchased the land because it was remote and quiet, far enough away from Boise that no one connected to his work would think to look there. He wrote that over the past year he had begun noticing irregularities in financial records at the construction firm where he worked as a senior accountant. Small discrepancies at first, transfers that didn't quite match the reported project budgets, payments routed through shell companies that seemed to appear and disappear within months. Daniel had spent most of his career making sure numbers lined up. When they didn't, he noticed. At first, he assumed it was simple accounting sloppiness, but the deeper he looked, the more the numbers refused to make sense. And eventually, certain names started appearing again and again inside those records. One of those names was Marcus Hale. I felt a cold tightening in my stomach. Marcus, my stepdaughter Olivia's husband. Daniel's letter didn't accuse him directly. The tone remained cautious, almost clinical. But Daniel wrote that Marcus's development company had appeared repeatedly in the transaction trail of several construction contracts connected to the same firm Daniel worked for. Daniel explained that he began copying documents, quietly storing them somewhere outside Boise, in case the situation turned out to be more serious than he initially thought. That was why the office existed. The cabin wasn't where he lived, it was where he kept evidence. My eyes drifted toward the shelves along the wall. Binders, file boxes, all carefully labeled. Daniel ended the letter with a line that felt heavier than the rest. I don't know how far this goes yet. And I don't know who might be involved. But if anything ever happens to me, I need you to know two things. First, none of this was your fault. Second, the truth is in this room. I lowered the letter slowly. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls again, making the window rattle faintly in its frame. For a long moment, I didn't move, because the realization settling over me wasn't just about Daniel's work anymore. If what he suspected was real, then the quiet life I thought we had built in Boise might have been standing on something far more fragile than I ever understood. And the worst part was the question now sitting heavily in the back of my mind. If Marcus's name appeared in those files, did Olivia know I folded the letter carefully and set it back on the desk? Then I looked once more at the shelves of records Daniel had left behind. Whatever he had been investigating, he had never finished it. And somehow, without meaning to, I had just stepped directly into the middle of it. The letter stayed on the desk long after I finished reading it. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, stretching long shadows across the clearing in front of the cabin. The wind had grown colder too, rattling the loose corner of a metal gutter somewhere along the roof. I sat there staring at the shelves of files Daniel had left behind. For years, I had believed my husband lived a careful, quiet life, built on numbers and patience. Daniel wasn't dramatic. He avoided conflict whenever he could. If there was a problem, he usually tried to solve it quietly and move on, which meant one thing I couldn't ignore anymore. If Daniel had built an entire hidden office to store these records, he must have been afraid. I stood slowly and walked toward the nearest shelf. Each binder had a label printed neatly across the spine: project numbers, company names, dates going back almost 18 months. Daniel had organized everything the way he organized his tax files at home: precise, methodical. But there was something else, too. He hadn't hidden the truth from me. He had hidden it for me, until the moment I found it. I pulled one of the binders from the middle shelf and opened it carefully on the desk. Inside were copies of contracts, payment transfers, and internal emails from the construction firm Daniel had worked for in Boise. At first, the numbers meant nothing to me, but the names did. Marcus Hale Development appeared again and again inside the payment chains. Some transactions were small consulting fees, others were large enough to make my stomach tighten. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moving through companies that seemed to exist only on paper. And then I noticed something that made the room feel smaller. Some of those transactions had dates only a few weeks before Daniel died. I leaned back slowly in the chair. Until that moment, I had been telling myself something comforting, that Daniel might have misunderstood something, that maybe the numbers looked strange but had an innocent explanation. But Daniel had been an accountant for 25 years. He knew the difference between sloppy bookkeeping and something deliberately hidden. And if Marcus was connected to these payments, then the cabin, the will, the entire arrangement suddenly felt less accidental than I had first believed. My eyes drifted toward Daniel's letter again. The truth is in this room. A few hours earlier, I had been angry about the will. Angry that Olivia and Marcus had taken the beautiful house in Boise while I was left with this forgotten cabin in Montana. Now the thought seemed almost ironic. They had laughed about how worthless this place was, but if they ever realized what Daniel had hidden here, this cabin would be the most dangerous piece of property they could imagine. I closed the binder slowly. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, something inside me stopped waiting for someone else to fix things. I understood something Daniel must have realized before he died. Silence wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It was protecting the people who had something to hide. I walked back to the shelf and pulled out a second binder. If Daniel had been gathering evidence, he must have planned to use it eventually, but he never got that chance, which meant the decision sitting in front of me now wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about responsibility. I could close the door to this office, lock the files away, and pretend none of it existed. Or I could finish what Daniel started. Outside, the wind swept across the clearing again, shaking the branches above the cabin. I looked down at the stacks of records covering the desk, and for the first time since arriving in Montana, I stopped feeling like the woman everyone expected me to be: quiet, grateful, easy to ignore, because somewhere in those files was the truth about Daniel. And whether Marcus knew it or not, I had just decided I was going to find it. The next morning came quietly over the Montana Valley. Cold light slipped through the tall pines surrounding the cabin, and a thin layer of frost had settled across the clearing outside. I had barely slept. Most of the night had been spent at Daniel's desk, moving slowly through the binders he had left behind. The deeper I looked, the clearer one thing became. Daniel hadn't been guessing. He had been building a case. By sunrise, the desk was covered with open folders, payment logs, property filings, email printouts. Every document pointed back to the same network of companies shifting money through construction projects that never seemed to finish. And Marcus Hale's development firm appeared in the center of it all like a hub. The strange thing was how carefully Daniel had documented everything. He hadn't just copied records, he had organized them in a way that made the pattern almost impossible to ignore, which meant Daniel had likely planned something. At some point, he had intended to show this to someone. The question now was, who? I stared at the small notebook sitting beside the binders. Daniel's handwriting covered every page with brief notes and arrows linking companies together. In the margin of one page, a single name appeared with a phone number written beside it. Thomas Grady. For a moment, I tried to remember where I had heard the name before. Then it clicked. Daniel had mentioned him once at dinner months ago. Thomas Grady was an attorney in Boise who specialized in financial crime investigations. Daniel had joked that Grady was the kind of lawyer who enjoyed untangling complicated numbers more than arguing in court. At the time, it had sounded like a passing comment. Now the name felt different. I picked up my phone and stared at the number Daniel had written down. If I called, there would be no pretending afterward that this was just something strange hidden in the past. It would become real. And if Marcus really was involved in what Daniel had uncovered, calling that number might start a chain of events none of us could stop. I stood by the window for a long time before dialing. Outside, the forest looked calm. Pine trees stood motionless against the pale winter sky, but inside the cabin, everything had already shifted. The phone rang 3 times before a man answered. Grady Law Offices. His voice was calm professional. I almost hung up, but something inside me remembered the last line of Daniel's letter. The truth is in this room. My name is Emily Carter, I said slowly. My husband was Daniel Carter. He worked as an accountant in Boise. There was a brief pause on the other end. I remember Daniel, the man replied carefully. That made my heart skip. He left me something, I continued. Files, financial records, a lot of them. Another pause. What kind of records? I looked at the open binders spread across Daniel's desk. Records that connect several construction contracts to companies that don't seem to exist anymore. The line went silent for several seconds. When Thomas Grady spoke again, his voice had changed. Not alarmed, focused. Mrs. Carter, he said quietly, are you somewhere safe right now? The question made my grip tighten on the phone. Yes, good, he said, because if what you're describing is what I think it might be, those files are extremely important. I felt the weight of the cabin around me then, the quiet forest, the locked office Daniel had built. All of it suddenly felt less like a forgotten property and more like something carefully placed out of reach. There's one more thing, I said. What's that? One of the companies that appears in the records belongs to my son-in-law. I heard a slow breath through the phone. What's his name? Marcus Hale. The silence that followed was longer this time. When Grady finally spoke again, his tone carried something new. Concern. I think we should meet as soon as possible, he said. I lowered the phone slowly after the call ended. For months, I had been living inside the quiet aftermath of Daniel's death, but the moment that call connected the story he had been trying to finish had started moving again, and somewhere far away in Boise, whether Marcus knew it or not, the first step toward the truth had already begun. 2 days later, I was driving south toward Boise. The early winter sky stretched gray across the highway as the mountains slowly gave way to open fields. I had left the Montana cabin before sunrise, packing only a few binders from Daniel's office into a locked case in the passenger seat. Thomas Grady had insisted we meet in person, not over the phone, not by email. In situations like this, he had said carefully, paper is safer than conversations. At the time, his caution had sounded excessive. Now, as the miles slipped past the windshield, I wasn't so sure anymore, because something had already begun to shift. Late the previous evening, my phone had buzzed with a message I hadn't expected. Olivia. My stepdaughter rarely texted me directly. Most of our conversations happened during family dinners or short holiday calls, but the message that appeared on my screen had been unusually direct. Marcus says you've been going through Daniel's things in Montana. At first, I stared at the words without responding. I hadn't told anyone where I was, not Olivia, not anyone in Boise, which meant the information had come from somewhere else, or someone else. I had replied carefully, yes, I've been sorting through some of Daniel's paperwork. Her response had arrived almost immediately. You should probably leave that alone. No explanation, no question, just a warning. Now, as the highway signs counted down the miles toward Boise, the meaning of that message felt heavier than it had the night before. Because Olivia hadn't asked what I found. She had only told me to stop. The Grady Law Office sat inside a quiet brick building a few blocks from the Boise courthouse. The winter wind pushed cold air through the streets as I carried the case of binders through the front door. Thomas Grady met me in the lobby. He was older than I expected, late 60s perhaps, with silver hair and the calm expression of someone used to studying complicated problems. "Mrs. Carter," he said, shaking my hand, "I'm glad you came." We moved into a private conference room overlooking the street. For nearly an hour, he flipped through Daniel's files slowly, page by page. Occasionally, he stopped to examine a document more closely, his brow tightening slightly before moving on. When he finally leaned back in his chair, the room felt noticeably quieter. "These records are extremely detailed," he said. "Daniel was thorough," I replied. Grady nodded. "Yes, and he was right to be concerned." My stomach tightened. "You see the same thing he did. I see evidence of a financial structure designed to move money through temporary companies," Grady said carefully. "Companies that disappear before anyone can follow the trail." And Marcus Grady didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid one of the documents across the table toward me. "Marcus Hale Development." The name appeared beside a series of payments connected to a housing development project outside Boise. "The transactions are indirect," Grady said, "but they're repeated often enough to raise serious questions." Before I could respond, his office phone buzzed softly on the table. Grady glanced at the screen. His expression changed. "Excuse me." He stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. Through the glass panel, I could see him speaking quietly, his posture tightening as the conversation continued. A few minutes later, he returned. The calm lawyer I had met an hour earlier now looked far more serious. "I think you should know something," he said. "What?" He folded his hands together carefully. "Marcus Hale was in my office this morning." The words hit like a sudden drop in temperature. "What do you mean he came by about an hour before you arrived?" Grady said. "He asked whether anyone had contacted me about Daniel Carter's financial records." My pulse quickened. "And what did you tell him, that I couldn't discuss my clients?" Grady paused. "But the fact that he came here at all means something important. What he knows, those records exist." The room felt smaller suddenly. For the first time since opening Daniel's letter, the danger he had hinted at no longer felt theoretical. Marcus wasn't waiting quietly in Boise. He was already moving, and somewhere in the middle of everything Daniel had uncovered, I had just stepped directly into Marcus Hale's line of sight. I didn't drive back to Montana that night. Instead, I stayed in Boise. Thomas Grady had insisted it was safer that way. If Marcus already suspected the files existed, returning immediately to the cabin might draw attention to the one place Daniel had tried to keep hidden. So I checked into a small hotel near the river, the kind business travelers used when they needed quiet more than luxury. But sleep didn't come easily. Marcus knowing about the records changed everything. Until that moment, I had assumed Daniel's evidence was hidden well enough to buy us time. Now it felt like the clock had already started moving. The next morning, Grady called early. "Come back to the office," he said. "There's something in the files I want you to see." By the time I arrived, several of Daniel's binders were already spread across the conference table again. Grady stood near the window with another man I hadn't met before. "This is Special Agent Daniel Ruiz," Grady said. "He works with the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI." The introduction made the room feel suddenly more serious. Ruiz shook my hand calmly. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Grady has shown me some of the documents your husband collected." I glanced at the binders on the table. "Do they mean what we think they mean?" Ruiz didn't answer directly. "They suggest a pattern of financial laundering through real estate development," he said carefully. "But patterns alone aren't enough for a federal investigation." Grady slid a particular folder across the table. "That's what we need to talk about." Inside were several email printouts Daniel had highlighted with yellow marker. Unlike the financial spreadsheets, these messages looked almost ordinary at first glance. Routine project updates, budget adjustments, construction delays, but Daniel had circled certain phrases: payment cleared through alternate vendor, temporary holding account approved, route through secondary partner. Ruiz tapped one of the pages. These emails confirm coordination between multiple companies, he said, but they still don't prove who controlled the system. And Marcus, I asked quietly. Ruiz studied the documents before answering. Right now, Marcus Hale appears connected to the outer layer of these transactions, meaning he may be benefiting from them, Ruiz said, but we still need proof that he knows how the structure works. The answer felt frustratingly incomplete. Marcus had already tried to track down the records. Surely that meant he knew more than Ruiz was suggesting. But then Grady turned to another page Daniel had marked. This is the part Marcus probably doesn't know exists. The document wasn't an email, it was a contract, a consulting agreement signed nearly a year earlier between Daniel's accounting firm and an outside financial review service. The signature at the bottom belonged to Daniel Carter. What is it? I asked. Your husband formally requested an independent audit of several construction accounts, Grady said. Ruiz nodded slowly. If that audit was completed, it would contain the full financial chain behind these projects. And where is it? I asked. Grady flipped to the final page of Daniel's notes. Daniel had written only 2 words in the margin: Deposit Box, Boise Federal Credit Union. The room went quiet. For the first time since opening the files, something about Daniel's planning made complete sense. He hadn't stored everything in Montana. He had split the evidence, part hidden in the cabin, and part locked somewhere Marcus couldn't easily reach. Ruiz looked at me carefully. If that audit exists, it could prove who controlled the money. And if Marcus finds it first, I asked. Grady answered this time. Then the entire investigation could disappear before it ever begins. I stared at Daniel's handwriting again. Deposit box. Suddenly, the quiet cabin in Montana felt like only half of the story Daniel had left behind. Because somewhere inside a small credit union in Boise, there might be a document capable of collapsing everything Marcus Hale had built. By Thursday morning, the cold in Boise had turned sharp enough to sting my face the moment I stepped outside the hotel. Thomas Grady met me in the lobby just after 8. Special Agent Daniel Ruiz arrived a few minutes later in an unmarked sedan. None of us wasted time pretending this was routine anymore. Late the night before, Grady had found something Daniel had tucked into the back of the same folder that mentioned the deposit box, a photocopy of the rental agreement. Both names were on it, Daniel Carter, Emily Carter. That was the first real advantage I had felt since the reading of the will. Boise Federal Credit Union opened at 9. The building itself was plain, almost forgettable, set back from the street behind a row of winter bare shrubs. Inside, everything looked painfully ordinary: fluorescent lights, quiet carpeting and a teller line, people handling errands that had nothing to do with the thing sitting like a weight in my chest. I signed the access form with a hand that felt steadier than I expected. The branch manager, a careful woman in her 50s named Karen Ellis, checked my identification twice, then escorted me to the vault. Grady went with me as counsel. Ruiz waited outside the secure area exactly where policy required him to wait. No shortcuts, no special treatment, just procedure. That made the moment feel more real, not less. Karen slid the metal box onto the small viewing table and stepped away. When she left the room, I looked at Grady for a second before lifting the lid. Inside was a thick sealed envelope, 1 flash drive, and a smaller packet marked in Daniel's handwriting, Final Audit. I broke the seal carefully. The report inside was not a summary. It was the full chain Daniel had been trying to prove existed: project accounts, shell companies holding transfers, internal approvals, and the final distribution routes. Marcus Hale's company wasn't just near the money. It was one of the central paths through which the money moved. And Olivia's name appeared too, not as a bystander, not as an uninformed spouse. She had signed approval forms connected to at least 3 of the outside entities. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, not because I was shocked anymore, because the last piece of doubt was gone. Grady read in silence beside me, then pulled out his phone. When he looked up, his expression had changed in a way I hadn't seen before. "This is enough," he said quietly. Ruiz met us in a private room upstairs. He reviewed the audit, the signature pages, and the drive, then made 2 calls without leaving the table. His tone stayed level, but everything after that began moving quickly. Not magically, officially. A preservation order was requested before noon. By early afternoon, Ruiz received confirmation that a federal financial crimes task force had opened an active case based on the audit package and Daniel's supporting records. That same hour, emergency holds were placed on several corporate accounts tied to the reviewed entities while the court process moved forward. Then the first visible consequence hit. Marcus called me. I let it ring once before answering. His voice was controlled, but only barely. "Emily," he said, "whatever you think you're doing, stop now. Not a denial, not confusion, fear." Before I could answer, he continued, "You have no idea how complicated this is." I looked through the conference room window at Agent Ruiz, already speaking to another office on speakerphone. "I think I understand enough," I said, and ended the call. 10 minutes later, Olivia left me a voicemail, then another. By the third one, she was crying. By the fourth, she was angry. By the fifth, she was blaming Daniel for everything. I didn't call her back, because by then, the thing Marcus had spent so much time protecting was no longer hidden in a cabin or locked in a box. It was inside the system now. And for the first time since Daniel died, Marcus and Olivia were the ones waiting to find out what would happen next. The first real snow of the season fell 3 weeks later. By then, most of the noise had already passed. Not quietly, of course. Nothing about the investigation had been quiet. The federal case moved forward faster than I expected once the audit report and Daniel's records entered the system. Asset freezes turned into formal charges. Subpoenas multiplied. Several shell companies dissolved almost overnight once investigators traced their ownership. Marcus Hale was indicted on multiple counts of financial fraud and conspiracy tied to the development network Daniel had uncovered. But what surprised most people in Boise wasn't Marcus. It was Olivia. Her name appeared repeatedly in the approval chain for several of the holding companies used to route payments. According to the investigators, those signatures made it impossible for her to claim she had no knowledge of the system. The news spread quickly through the business community Marcus had once moved through so easily. Contracts disappeared, investors withdrew. The development company that had once built half the new neighborhoods outside Boise shut its doors within weeks. When the charges became public, the silence around Daniel's death changed too. For the first time, people began speaking about him not as the quiet accountant who had passed away unexpectedly, but as the man who had uncovered something much larger than anyone realized. Thomas Grady called me the morning the indictment was announced. "It's official," he said. His voice carried something I hadn't heard before. Relief. "You did the right thing bringing those records forward." After the call ended, I drove north again. The road back to Montana felt different this time. The same mountains lined the horizon, the same forests stretched along the highway, but the weight I had carried during that first drive to the cabin had faded. When I pulled into the clearing, the cabin stood exactly the way Daniel had left it, quiet, simple. Snow had gathered along the roof and across the empty ground around the porch. Inside the office still looked the same too, the shelves of files, the wooden desk, Daniel's letter resting where I had first opened it. I sat in his chair again and read the final line once more. "The truth is in this room." At the time, I had thought Daniel meant the files, the evidence, the investigation. But sitting there now, I understood something else he had left behind. Daniel hadn't just protected the truth, he had protected me. He knew the house in Boise, the one Olivia and Marcus had fought so hard to claim, would eventually collapse under the weight of everything they had built around it. So he left me the place that still stood, the place no one wanted, the place where the truth could survive. I walked outside onto the porch as the snow continued to fall softly through the trees. For months after Daniel's death, I had believed the cabin was the worst thing he left me. Now I understood it had been the one thing he trusted me to keep. Not the house, not the money, the truth. And with the case now moving through the courts, my role in it was finally ending. The rest belonged to the system, to time, and to the quiet life Daniel and I had once planned before everything changed. The wind moved gently through the pines surrounding the clearing. For the first time in a long while, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like peace. And somehow, standing there in the snow, I realized Daniel had never really left me the worst house he owned. He had left me the only one that was still honest. If this story made you think about justice, family, or the difficult choices people sometimes face, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this remind us that truth often takes time to surface. If you'd like to hear more stories about resilience and quiet justice, feel free to like, subscribe, and join us for the next one.